Hi everyone, I'm Miri. My talk is called Mental Health in Your Community, and my background on this topic is I studied psychology in undergrad, and while I was there I also founded a sort of like a peer counseling group that's still active years after I've graduated. And the reason I did that was because after getting diagnosed with depression at the end of my freshman year of college, I realized that mental health is more than an individual endeavor. It really takes a community to help people recover and also to help people from developing some of these issues in the first place, right? We're very used to thinking of it as something that's just inside your own brain, with no influence from like the outside society, but that's not true. And partially because of that experience, I decided to go on and become a therapist professionally. So I studied social work at Columbia, from which I just graduated. I've also founded an online support group for non-theists struggling with mental health issues, and I also volunteer as sort of a counselor for survivors of sexual violence. So all of these experiences have showed me how important community can be in helping people cope. And as the title of this talk suggests, I'm not just talking about individuals, right? I'm talking about communities. And the community is basically any group of people with shared values or norms that interacts with each other. So a workplace could be a community, a neighborhood could be a community, and a poly society of sorts could be a community, and so can like a polycule, which is like a cute little term for partners that are all interacting with each other, right? So there's two ways that I've seen communities struggle when it comes to supporting the mental health of their members, and they're sort of two ends of a spectrum. So one is stigmatizing mental illness and expecting community members to either keep all their problems to themselves, or maybe take it to a therapist, or maybe some of their closest partners. The other is the whole opposite of that, and that's expecting community members to basically do the work of mental health professionals, to support each other constantly, to be there every time someone's having a crisis, sort of in addition to or even instead of that person's therapist. Neither of these approaches results in a healthy community. In one, people can't trust each other to have each other's back when things are going wrong, and in the other, people get burned out and resentful because they're doing the work that a trained professional should be doing, and no one's actually getting the care that they need. So I'll talk about sort of the first half of that first. So not only is mental illness itself stigmatized in our society, but in many communities it's considered inappropriate to talk too extensively about one's personal struggles. And the norms for that vary, right? At work, you might not be expected to bring anything up at all. With your friends, you might be able to say like, oh, I'm having a really shitty day, but maybe they expect you to cheer right up after you say that, right? So people might be expected to put a positive spin even on really negative things so that they don't quote-unquote ruin the mood. They might say things like, well, I lost my job recently, but this has been a great opportunity to figure out what I really want to do with my life. Or they might say, college has been really stressful, but I'm learning a lot. And, sometimes that's really true. I'm not saying that there never is a silver lining to difficult stuff that we deal with, but the problem is that sometimes people wish that they could actually say, I lost my job recently and I'm really worried about what's going to happen. Or, college is really stressful and I don't know how I'm going to get through the semester. But because we're expected to put such a positive spin on everything, these feelings never actually get verbalized. So, as we've sort of just experienced, it can be difficult to talk about negative things, and that stigma gets even worse when we're talking about mental illness, such as depression or anxiety or others. And many people still believe that mental illness is a sign of weakness or laziness, or that it's not a real illness, or that you should just snap out of it, or that people use mental illness to avoid their responsibilities, right? So even if you've never heard statements like that from people in your own community, in which case I would say you're very lucky, it's prevalent in our society, and that can make it really difficult to open up even to people that you already trust. And stigma can also make it difficult for people to seek professional help, which I think the idea is like, oh, people should take that to the therapy office and not bother other people with it. But in fact, if you keep being told that mental illness isn't real, you might not even believe that you deserve help or that it's a real issue that you can even get help with. And also, people worry that if anyone finds out that they're going to a therapist, they'll sort of deal with negative judgments from people. So stigma really harms people, I think, in a lot of ways. And, it's good to remember that our negative stereotypes about mental illness are not necessarily based on scientific evidence or fact. They're handed down by our families, by our culture, by the media. You know, and mental illness is an illness just like any other. You know, you wouldn't tell a person with diabetes that they're lazy, or you wouldn't tell a person with cancer to snap out of it. So, you know, you probably shouldn't say that to people with mental illness either. I think sometimes people want to avoid difficult topics like these because they're not really sure how to respond when someone's telling them something really difficult like that. It can be tempting to offer advice, especially if you think that you've been through something similar. But many people who are going through difficult times actually feel kind of dismissed and unheard if people immediately rush to give them advice. So active listening is a technique that can be used to both understand what someone's going through and also to help them feel like you're really listening and like you really care. And the idea behind it is that often when we have conversations with people, when they're the ones who are talking, we spend a lot of the time thinking about what we're going to say next, or maybe worrying about how we're coming across or how we look, or thinking about something else entirely, and I think everyone's been guilty of that, me as well. And active listening reframes the active listening as more about understanding what the person is saying. So when you are active listening to someone, you reframe what they tell you and reflect it back to them, or you ask them clarifying questions. So they might give you a whole rant about problems with their family or problems at work, and you might say, "It sounds like work is really stressful right now." And they might say, "Yeah, it is." Or they might say, "You know I just complained a lot, but actually it's okay." Basically, the end goal is for you to understand how they feel about it, as opposed to just making your own opinions about it. And you might think that if someone's telling you something sad, you shouldn't validate that by saying, "Yeah, that sounds really bad," because that would somehow make them feel even worse. Like, "Yeah, you're right, it is really bad." But in fact, that's not usually how it works. Instead, they feel heard and listened to and understood, and that's really, really important. Unfortunately, a lot of the time, people don't see it that way, and they think that if someone's saying something sad, then you should immediately maybe, like, offer advice, or change the topic to something lighter, or make a joke about it to sort of lighten the mood. But then people feel like not only are you not really interested in what they have to say, but they also end up feeling like they need to put that positive spin on it themselves, like we were just saying. And that's how I usually feel, for instance, if I'm saying, "I'm having a really difficult time in school," and people are immediately like, "Oh, but you're learning a lot, right?" Or, "But college is so awesome, right?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I guess it is, okay," but I don't really feel that way. So it can actually be really, really reassuring to just hear, "Yeah, that's really hard," or "I'm sorry you're going through this." Once you've really understood someone's situation, you might feel like, okay, now I get to give them advice, right? I think it's a better idea to ask them if they're looking for advice first, because a lot of the time, people actually really just want to be listened to and they want someone to understand what they're going through. They don't necessarily want advice. But an even better thing to do is to actually ask how you can help. You know, like they might say, "Oh, I just wanted to share, that's all I needed." Or they might ask if you know of any good therapists, or they might ask like, "Hey, can you just come and hang out and distract me from all this crap?" Sometimes when people are going through something really difficult, though, they might not really know what to ask for because they might not really know what would help. And if you ask someone, "How can I help?" and they're sort of really confused, or they're like, "Oh, I don't know," you can go ahead and offer specific things that you might be able to do to help, and put that ball in their court and let them decide if that's something that they want or not. So you can say like, "Would it help if I came over and made dinner?" Or "Would it help if we went out and got ice cream and just ignored all this for a while?" And then see what they say. But like I said, often just being listened to and being heard is really what helps people feel better in that moment. So now that we've talked about how much of a difference you can make by supporting people going through difficult things, we're going to talk about how to maintain boundaries while doing so. And this, I think, is especially important in the poly context because, you know, when we're in a poly community, we have all these partners who maybe all know each other, we get so interconnected, and we can get so focused on supporting each other that we forget to support ourselves. And that comes back to that second problem I mentioned at the beginning, which is communities in which people are expected to sacrifice their own needs for those of others. And I've noticed that in a lot of poly communities. And when you care about someone a lot, whether they're a partner or a close friend, or even just someone that you see at meetups that you like, you know, it's easy to fall into the trap of believing that their needs matter more than yours. I think some of us, especially women, but anyone can fall into this, believe that like it's really, really important to support people no matter at what cost to ourselves. And it's also easy to forget that you actually have needs that might prevent you from being available all the time to listen to them or to help them. Like, sleep is a need, and positive social interactions that don't leave you drained are also a need. And if supporting a person through their mental illness or through their struggles is preventing you from taking care of yourself, that's a sign that you might need to set some boundaries. And sometimes I think it feels like doing them a favor when you ignore your needs to help them. But the problem is that like, this sort of thinking will eventually lead you to sort of resent them and be overwhelmed and angry, and you can't support someone while you're resenting them. So something I heard a lot from friends when I was depressed was something like, I felt really overwhelmed by listening to you talk about depression all the time, but you were just so sad and I felt like I had to. And this caused me a lot of guilt for a really long time, and guilt is something that if you've ever struggled with depression, you know you already get a lot. And I felt like I had somehow coerced these people into helping me. But over time, I've started to understand that just as I have a responsibility to check in with someone before dumping a whole bucket of sadness on their head, they also have a responsibility to set their own boundaries, because none of us are mind readers. So, and how do you know when you need to step back? So, one is that you're just starting to feel overwhelmed and exhausted and resentful, and that's enough of a reason. Even if you don't think that that's legitimate, even if you feel like you ought to be able to be there for them more, once you're starting to feel that way, it's okay to set a boundary around how much you're able to listen and support them. Another is if they're consistently talking to you about things that feel like they're way, way, way above what you're trained or knowledgeable about, and they don't have a professional counselor to take that to. So, for instance, and we'll talk about, like, suicide in a moment, but you know, while you can play a huge role in helping a suicidal person call a hotline or get to the ER, if you're consistently doing this for the same person, that's a sign that they need the sort of help that you might not be qualified to provide for them. And we'll also talk in a minute about referring people to those who can help them. So, saying no is difficult, which I think is why many people try to avoid it entirely, as much as possible. But not saying no, rather than setting the boundary, is what tends to lead to all these like huge relationship and friendship blow-ups that people with mental illness are all too familiar with. So something that you can do to make it sort of a little easier for both of you is when you say no to something, tell them what you are able to do. So you might say, sorry, I'm not really at a place right now where I can listen to a lot of difficult things, but would it help if we watched some TV instead, or if we played a game instead? You can also remind them that even if you're not able to be there for them all the time, you still care. You know, you could say, the fact that I can't really listen to you right now doesn't mean that I don't care about you, and I really hope you get better soon. You can also point them to other resources, which I'll get to in a minute. You know, you might say, it sounds like you're going through a lot, have you ever thought about talking to a counselor? And the reason that's such an important thing to say is because, as I mentioned earlier, we stigmatize mental illness so much in our society, and this might be the first time that anyone has told that person that they have a valid problem, and that they might deserve help for that problem. They might have never considered, wow, like, what if I do need therapy? That's definitely how it was for me. I think the first time I went to therapy is my partner at the time said, have you ever thought that you might have depression? Have you ever thought about going to your campus counseling center? And that was the first time I'd ever heard that. I had thought that it was just something I needed to deal with on my own or talk through with my partner. And another thing you can do, again, is to support them in their effort to get professional help. You know, you could say, would it help if I was there when you made the call to the therapist? Because this is something that a lot of people really struggle with, and sometimes they really need that support from someone that, you know, someone who loves them and cares about them, so that they're able to finally pick up the phone and make that call, or walk in and get the appointment. So, unfortunately, some people with mental illness, especially if it's depression or anxiety, they might hear an attempt to set boundaries as rejection. And this, I think, happens in a lot of our relationships all the time. Not even necessarily boundaries around listening, but sexual boundaries, relationship boundaries, all sorts of things like that. And that's really difficult, but that's not your fault. It's not because you set the boundary, it's because they have a mental illness and they need help. But something that you can do to make this a little easier is being extra clear about things that you might have thought were obvious and didn't need to be stated explicitly. For instance, I care about you even when I'm not available to help you, or, it's not your fault that I'm feeling overwhelmed, you weren't wrong to talk to me, I just need to take care of myself now. And like I said, you might think like, well, duh, but when people are really in a bad spot mentally, they sort of tend to blame themselves for everything, and they'll think like, okay, like, I should never go to my partner with anything. and you can really help them by reminding them that that's not true, and it's not their fault. Mentioned a few times this idea of referring people to resources. And this is really important because if you can't help someone, chances are somebody else can. And so people do multi-hour trainings on what I'm about to talk about, so if you don't feel like this prepares you for anything, you are not alone. There's more information out there if you're interested. And what I'm going to talk about is when people are expressing suicidal thoughts. That is always serious. Even if you don't think that they're intending to follow through on it, it's always something to take seriously, because even if it's a quote-unquote call for attention, which I don't really like that phrase, but it's a thing that happens, the reason they're doing that is because they're in a lot of pain, and this is how they're expressing that pain. So if someone is expressing suicidal thoughts to you, ask them if they would be willing to call a suicide hotline or go to the ER themselves and check themselves in. The common advice here is to call 911 if you're at all in doubt of their safety. I would urge some caution about this because the police are not always safe for people to be around, especially as we've been hearing if they're a person of color, if they're mentally ill, which often if they're expressing suicidal thoughts they probably are. And another reason that this is really difficult is because often the police will treat them rather violently. I've seen people get handcuffed and thrown to the ground because they got called up, because they were suicidal, which is terrible, and I think this really badly needs to be reformed, but right now that's how it is. So I would say only call 911 if you are seriously concerned that this person is about to hurt themselves and there isn't anything else that can be done. You can't go over there, you can't see if anyone else can go over there, they're refusing to call a hotline or go to the ER, then 911 is probably your best bet. So on the lighter side of things, if someone tells you that they'd like to go to therapy but they don't know how, ask them if they have insurance, because some people don't know that your insurance website will actually allow you to get a list of providers in the area, and it can even get it pretty specific. They can get within 5 miles of my location, they can search by availability, by the person's degree, by the specific issues that they work with. And even though word of mouth is often a better way to find a therapist, this can be really useful for someone who just needs someone to talk to right now and to be sure that it's covered by their insurance. And if they don't have insurance, then you actually can go ahead and just Google free or sliding scale therapy Columbus, and you'll get a ton of results. There's a lot of community mental health centers, and any sort of training center, a graduate school that prepares social workers or therapists, will often offer free or sliding scale therapy. That is usually pretty good quality. There's also a lot of hotlines for people who are dealing with specific issues. So there's the Rape, Assault, and Incest National Network for people dealing with sexual violence, and that's the one I volunteer for. And it's an online hotline, so they don't even have to call. They just go online 24/7 and chat with a trained volunteer. There's also the Trevor Project, which is for LGBTQ young people, and there's the Trans Lifeline, which is for transgender individuals specifically. And there's a ton of others out there, and the people on them are usually trained to deal with or work with that specific issue or population. And a lot of people who are LGBT or who've experienced sexual violence or who are dealing with these other specific issues, they might not feel safe or comfortable calling a general hotline because they worry that the people there aren't trained to deal with their specific issues. Unfortunately, that is sometimes true. I had a friend who was feeling suicidal and called a suicide hotline, and when he mentioned that he's gay, the volunteer on the hotline told him that he should accept Jesus and not be gay anymore, and then he won't be suicidal anymore, which is wrong. So yeah, sometimes, unfortunately, that fear is founded. So, the last thing I wanted to cover is, we've talked about a lot of pretty serious stuff, directly supporting people who are going through something, referring people who are suicidal, but there are also a lot of smaller and simpler things that anyone can do to support mental health in their community. One of those is to avoid using words relating to mental illness in a stigmatizing or negative way. So sometimes we might call people crazy or insane in order to sort of insult them. And those are terms that refer to mental illness, and what you're sort of saying when you say that is that having a mental illness is bad and makes you a bad person. Another thing that people do is they'll casually throw around words like OCD or schizophrenia when they don't actually have those diagnoses. They might be like, oh, I like my books in a particular order, I'm so OCD, haha. That's not OCD, that's just being orderly. OCD itself is a pretty terrible and anxiety-provoking condition. Or they might call things bipolar when what they really mean is, this person has some mood swings, or this thing really varies. Or they might call things schizo, And often, like, the schizophrenic sort of adjective that gets thrown around is not even based on what the disorder actually is. It used to be, the reason, the place that term comes from is that they used to think that people with schizophrenia had, like, split minds, and that the schism is the split. So they'll call things schizophrenic when they have, like, two different sides to them. And that's not even what that means, and what happens when people use that sort of language is that it promotes inaccurate, like, depictions of that mental illness. So, and the problem with these words, like, you might think, like, oh, it's not a big deal, I'm just joking around, but it sort of sends the message that mental illness is either just not real or not a big deal. Like, it's just the same as wanting to have all your books in a row or being kind of sad today because you had a bad day at work, or it sends the message that it's something bad and to be ashamed of. So another thing you can do, and we talked about this a little earlier with our activity, is to answer as honestly as you're comfortable when people ask you how you're doing, and then to listen actively and attentively when others are doing the same thing. You know, don't rush to reframe it positively for them. Just listen and acknowledge that things can be hard. And this is important because it sets a social norm in our community, that sharing negative things is okay, and that it's okay to be upset about things, and that not everything always has a silver lining. Further, if you've had a mental illness or you've seen a therapist or are currently, and you feel comfortable sharing this with people, go ahead and do that. That is extremely important because as soon as you do that, people see you as someone that they can turn to, someone that they can ask for a therapist recommendation, someone that they can answer honestly like, sorry, I can't hang out today, I'm feeling really depressed, instead of having to cover it up. And I know that this isn't always safe for everyone. I think especially in the workplaces where it gets tricky, so only do this if you're comfortable, but you'd be surprised how many people will be like, oh my god, me too. When I first started talking about having depression back during my sophomore year of college, I was the only person I knew who had it. I thought I was the only one. I thought I had this, like, rare disorder that nobody else deals with, but as soon as I started writing and talking about it, people started coming to me and saying I thought I was the only one. No, I mean, we can't all be the only ones, right? So, and finally, you can learn more about mental health and share that with others by reading, by attending talks, listening to podcasts, whichever way you enjoy learning, do that. And this is really important because the community is made up of the people in it. And the more informed the people in it are, the more prepared they will be to support each other when difficult things come up. So that's all I had. If you have any questions, please ask or email me. Thank you.